Hello and welcome to the Literary Lair. I don't know if I've ever gotten to say this formally on the show before, but the Blue Beetle is my all-time favorite superhero. You ever wonder where BlackScarabFilmZ came from? When I was a kid, I created this superhero pretty heavily based on the Batman the Brave and the Bold version of Ted Kord named the Black Scarab. Black being a cool color, and scarab being another word for beetle, and I eventually started using it as an online handle before I got into video production, and then I added the films part because I thought it sounded cool. I love all the iterations of the character. Jaime Reyes was my first exposure to the character through Batman the Brave and the Bold, but my favorite version of the character is Ted Kord. One of my favorite things I've ever picked up at a convention is this copy of Ted's first issue after DC relaunch following Crisis on Infinite Earths. So the fact that DC is canceling the Blue Beetle Rebirth book after 18 issues is very disappointing to me. The book had problems, don't get me wrong, but it's Ted Kord and Jaime Reyes working together. And the last few issues have been really decent, even if Ted hasn't been present for them. Hopefully the final issue will have Ted back and hopefully a Booster Gold cameo. Anyway, to celebrate my favorite superhero and pay tribute to the cancelled book, I want to take a look at some Blue Beetle material here on the show. But since I work in prose and not comic books, we have to take a little trip back. Before Jaime, before Ted, before the Blue Beetle was even owned by DC Comics. Back in the early days of comics, the Golden Age, comic books generally had 2 pages in it that instead of being comic pages or advertisements for X-ray glasses and the like, were short stories, either standalones or serialized stories that continued from issue to issue. You might notice that those dropped off in the middle of the Golden Age, and there's actually a really interesting reason for why they exist in the first place. The reason they existed in the first place was to take advantage of a regulation set in place by the United States Postal Service. See, back then, magazines got cheaper postage, but comic books weren't considered magazines, because in order to be considered magazines, the comic books needed to have 2 pages of text in them. The companies got around it by having writers do small pieces to include in the middle of the book so that they could benefit from the regulation, though later on, as far as I can tell, they would be superseded by the now more well-known letter pages. But despite the fact that they were devised to fudge the system and get cheaper mail rates, they're rather interesting, and I never see anyone talk about them. And I don't mean Linkara skipping over them when he looks at old comics. I mean the fact that they're basically relegated to the old comics themselves. When older stuff is reprinted in collections and the like, they're usually not included alongside them, which I feel is wrong because they're a neat bit of comics history. At this point, I bet you're wondering what this has to do with the Blue Beetle. Well, while the prose stuff was mostly gone by the time Ted took over the mantle, there are a fair few stories featuring the original Blue Beetle, Dan Garrett. I've been wanting to showcase some of these prose stories that sat alongside the superhero comics of yore since last summer, and do another edition of Short Story Sanctuary, but I couldn't figure out how to fit them into the show's format, so I figured it would be easiest to theme the stories around a single character. In this case, the Blue Beetle. I've got a good selection of some that I thought were the most interesting, so let's get straight to it. Up, up, and away. Sorry, Dan Garrett didn't really have a catchphrase. Bwahaha? This is Short Story Sanctuary number 2. Okay, so no covers to talk about since 1, I'm pretty sure Linkara talked about some of these back in Blue Skying, and 2, I need to dedicate that time to Dan Garrett's backstory. See, even if you're familiar with the current DC or previous Charlton iteration of Dan Garrett, you probably don't know his original origin from back when the company that published and owned the Blue Beetle was Fox Features Syndicate. And if you want the frankly fascinating history of the Blue Beetle, go check out Linkara's Blue Skying retrospective. It is a brilliant set of videos. Anyway, Dan Garrett was a rookie patrolman, as stated in the intro to his radio series, which is honestly not half bad. But at night, he took the mantle of the Blue Beetle, striking fear into the hearts of criminals. Dan is unfortunately the Blue Beetle that I'm the least familiar with. I've read most of Jaime's initial run and Ted's DC relaunch, and the first volume of Justice League International, plus the recent DC Rebirth stuff, but I've never really read any Dan Garrett, partially because he's so forgotten in the lore nowadays, since he's so removed from the current Beetle, and because most of his stuff is only available on public domain comic sites that I only just recently got familiar with. But that doesn't mean that his place as the first iteration of my favorite superhero isn't valued. Garrett's main supporting cast during the time that these stories take place is Mike Manigan, his partner on the force, who always wants to catch the Blue Beetle unaware that he's right under his nose, and Dr. Franz, a scientist who developed a special drug, Vitamin 2X, that gives Dan his powers as opposed to a magic scarab. The issues I got these stories from came out of the very beginning of the Fox Comics run, and are from Dan's first solo series, so they're all from the late 1930s and early 40s. So let's start with the stories themselves. The first story is Death Rides on Horseback, which features the Blue Beetle chasing after a person who has been murdering policemen on their beat and riding away on horseback. Man, I knew that the Death Wish reboot was going to be different, but I'm not sure that this is the right course of action for Paul Kersey to take. And the story is accompanied by a photo of the Blue Beetle that I'm sure is supposed to look heroic or something, but it just looks like he's very disappointed in me. I'm sorry, Dan, what did I do to offend you? I don't know if this is better or worse than the creepy Peter Davison from the Castrovalva cover. After several cases of this emerge, the city is just about at the brink, with the police sergeant Madden telling the remaining cops that if they don't stop the man in 24 hours, New York City will be under martial law. Obviously, this means that the Blue Beetle is on the case. He waits around for the killer to strike again and chases him on his own horse. Unfortunately, the killer shoots and mortally wounds his horse, but the Blue Beetle simply leaps off his horse onto the killer's and rides into the killer's hideout, hidden in a secret entrance in a cliff. As the Beetle remarks about how ingenious that is for a hideout, the killer decides to monologue a bit about his plan. Namely, that he planned for the Blue Beetle to catch him that night, since if he was going to destroy the police force, he knew that he'd also have to deal with the vigilante as well. He activates a secret trap door and drops the Beetle into some sort of dungeon. After he gets over the shock of being dropped, the Blue Beetle starts feeling around and figures out that he's inside an auxiliary reservoir that's no longer used, but is still connected to the currently used one, so he's able to escape and quickly change back into his civilian identity to tell Sergeant Madden where the killer's hideout is, where Dan makes quick work of the killer, knocking him out in one punch. The story ends with Sergeant Madden remarking at how quickly Dan was able to subdue the killer, saying that the only other person capable of that would be the Blue Beetle himself, to which Dan replies that he's the next guy that they have to get, and Dan wants to take care of the Beetle himself. The next story is Mass Murder by Radioactive Salt, which frankly sounds more like a newspaper headline than a superhero story, but the more interesting thing to note is that unlike the last story, this one has an author listed, Charles Nicholas, the man who is widely regarded as the creator of the Blue Beetle, so I expect high quality from this one. And the story starts with an explanation for the title. The story is told from the perspective of Charlie Storm, the lost brother to Johnny and Sue, an ace reporter and supporting cast member of Blue Beetle, who is telling the story of the Blue Beetle's latest adventure to his editor. At a local orphanage, several children became mysteriously ill of radiation poisoning, some even dying, despite them not being anywhere near radioactive material. They don't even play in the old toxic waste dump by the creek. Professor Eduardo Srapelli, a psychologist who is responsible for the food serving at the orphanage, which totally doesn't raise any red flags, blames radium watches that were given to the kids, which the kids then licked because children are usually known to lick watches? Was this a thing in the 40s? Was that like their version of the cinnamon challenge? Hey guys, today we're going to be doing the Radium Watch Challenge. I know you all know what radium watches are. That is watches where the dials are painted with a special paint that allows it to glow in the dark, which is the zenith that science is ever going to reach. I mean, glow in the dark? That is awesome. So anyway, the challenge is that you lick it and then you see how long you can stay standing before you succumb to radiation poisoning. So let's see how long I can do it. I think I'm going to be able to go for a while. Doesn't taste half bad, you know. Is it hot in here, or is it just... Though the funny thing that Charlie Storm remarks at is that the watches didn't show any traces of radiation to do that, but the doctors banned the watches anyway, and the kids got better for a little while, and then started getting sick again, which is when the Blue Beetle took the case and started looking into it. The Blue Beetle drops his beetle onto Srapelli's table and confronts him, requesting that Srapelli try a little salt from a bottle on Srapelli's table. See, Srapelli, in case you didn't already figure it out, was the one infecting the kids using radioactive salt. It was part of an experiment with the kids as the lab rats. You gotta love the 1940s, back when you could use kids as your test subjects and no one would be able to detect it. The Blue Beetle is not happy about this, and is probably as angry as I've ever seen him, apart from when he went on that rampage trying to kill Ted Cord. Professor Srapelli pushes the Blue Beetle into a room and tosses in a bottle of fluoride that shatters and releases poisonous fumes. But that doesn't stop the Blue Beetle. Fighting back his sluggishness and burning eyes, he rushes the door and chases down Srapelli. I know I said that Ted Cord is my favorite, but Dan Garrett is amazing. Not only did he leap off of a dying horse onto a moving one, but when he was hit with poison gas and felt the effects of it getting to him, he still managed to bust down a locked door. This dude is unstoppable. How he got killed in Jarvis's lab is beyond me. Then he gets to the stairs, and as Srapelli runs down, the Blue Beetle leaps over the railing and tumbles down the stairs on Srapelli's back, and then manages to beat the crap out of him after they land a story down. Dan-bound Srapelli takes the salt and delivers him to one of the doctors in charge of the radiation case. After Charlie Storm gets off the phone with his editor, he remarks that he should talk with Dan Garrett and Mike Mannigan, since Mannigan is trying to catch the Blue Beetle, though he notices that Dan isn't that interested in the case as much as Mike is. The next story is The Blue Beetle's Quiet Night, a story that has Dan Garrett try to relax one night, but being constantly interrupted by being called into action as the Blue Beetle. Actually, it starts with Dan taking another policeman's beat, since that guy has the flu, and it's all the better for Dan, because thanks to the Blue Beetle, the only place with any crime is where that other cop was assigned, the docks. That night, he narrowly saves a teenage girl from committing suicide, and Dan notices that she has marijuana on her breath. Because marijuana causes suicidal thoughts? I mean, I guess paranoia will do that to you. Dan tries to probe Charlie Storm for information, and he tells Dan that the girl wasn't the first, that 3 other girls did the same thing, though none of them were lucky enough to survive. The man who sold the girls the marijuana was a gangster by the name of Bugs Carrot. Seriously, Bugs Carrot. It's not quite as hilarious as Big Dicks, but it's definitely up there. He can't be caught, though, because the higher-ups in the gang have political protection, and Bugs is just a pawn. Dan decides that he's gonna crash the party where Bugs is selling the marijuana, and needs to get a few capsules of vitamin 2X. So he goes into Dr. Franz's pharmacy and says, what's up, Doc? I apologize, that joke was terrible. I'll escort myself out.
What a maroon!
The Blue Beetle crashes the party, and when Bugs is about to pass off some joints to the high school kids, they instead find a beetle in the box. When did he have time to do that? And why didn't Bugs check the box beforehand? Anyway, the teens run away, and when one of Bugs' men remarks that the police can't catch them, but the Blue Beetle can, Dan agrees with them, revealing his presence in the room. They try to shoot him, but he's already removed the magazines from their guns. Okay, I call foul on that. I get that maybe they wouldn't have noticed that the box didn't have the joints in them, but they didn't notice that their guns weren't loaded? I mean, even if he did it beforehand, it still feels like they should have noticed. The Beetle confronts Bugs, demanding to see his boss, but his boss shows himself right then and there, Big Boy Riley, who decides that the four of them, Riley, Bugs, a henchman, and the Beetle, are going to go for a little drive. As they approach a bridge, Dan leaps into action and knocks the three of them out before hopping out of the car right as it plunges into the river. Holy crap! I mean, I know that sometimes heroes have to kill, but man, even Frank Castle would say that was too far. Well, okay, maybe not Frank Castle, but still, too far. Dan calls the authorities and the next day talks with Charlie, who tells him that the gang is gone and their leadership is all in the morgue, as Dan remarks on how quiet his beat was. And for the final story, it wouldn't be the golden age of comics without some good old-fashioned racism. In The Mystery of the Vanishing Corpses, Dan Garrett tries to solve a case where, when he was guarding a recently murdered woman's body, it went missing. Oh, this one's easy. Bela Lugosi stole it so that he can inject his wife with the woman's glandular fluid to keep his wife looking young. He goes to see Dr. Franz, since he can't make heads or tails of why someone would take the bodies, and while talking, gets the idea to return to the crime scene as the Blue Beetle to find the missing clue, whatever it is that the cops can't seem to find. While he's there, he finds a false back to a drawer, and inside are piles of rubies.
There's Leggy, Army, Navy, Eyeball, and, Doc.
And as he looks over them, he's clocked from behind and knocked out. The many concussions of Dan Garrett. He wakes up tied to a chair in a room lit only by a kerosene lamp. This is where the vitamin 2X would come in handy, but Dan forgot to take some before suiting up. And this is why Batman has a utility belt. This is where the racism shows up, as the assailant, or should I say assailants, come into the room to confront Dan. His assailants are described by the story as three men of Oriental features, and are referred to only as the Orientals. When they come in, Dan thanks them for giving him the final clue as to solving the mystery of the case. He asked if they want to hear it, and they humor him, letting Dan reveal that the corpses were stolen because the murdered woman was a jewel thief, and the men wanted the rubies since they couldn't find them in the room itself, so they assumed that they were hidden on the woman's person since they couldn't find the secret hatch in the drawer. The men tell Dan that it's great that he solved the case, but they're about to leave the country, and by the time he escapes, they'll be long gone. But Dan assures them that they will not, as he's no longer tied up. He used the lamp to burn the ropes, and then called up the district attorney, leaving the phone on while he told the story, and they admitted their wrongdoings. They try to take him out, but Dan overpowers them, and Dan hightails it out of there before the authorities show up, secure in knowing that he did a job well done in solving the baffling case. Obviously, Dan Garrett is awesome. He's the Blue Beetle, and all of the Blue Beetles are awesome, and he's the one who started it all. And from what I know about his Fox Comics run, he seems pretty standard for how he was characterized there. What I like the most about Dan here is that we get a good idea throughout these stories of where his moral compass points. Yes, I disagree with throwing the drug dealers into the river for selling pot to teenagers, mainly because teenagers and pot are just a thing that happens nowadays, but what really nails down what I love about Dan Garrett is the radioactive salt story. He beats the snot out of a man who murdered several children for the sake of science, and it is glorious. And not only is Dan Garrett awesome from a character standpoint, but he's also crazy capable. The acrobatics, the fighting, the ability to steal ammo before they even notice it's gone. The part where he literally staves off poison and still tackles the guy. How the hell did the three guys in the Vanishing Corpses story manage to get the drop on him and knock him out? And I have to hand it to these authors. The minor supporting characters are all pretty varied and interesting. You don't really expect that from something designed to fudge the system to have well-written characters, but they managed it. I mean, some of them are admittedly stock, but they're used in an interesting fashion. Charlie Storm being the narrator for one, and Dan's Ear to the Streets in another. And then you have Dr. Franz, who admittedly is just there to tell Dan to take vitamin 2X, but he's still pretty interesting. Professor Shrapelli being so utterly despicable in just 2 pages. Which reminds me a lot of Morgan Eggs from the current season of Supergirl, where Eggs did a similar thing, trying to discredit Lena Luthor by poisoning children at public pools with lead. Unfortunately, he has not gotten the snot beaten out of him by Dan Garrett, but here's hoping. And it's not like he solves the same case with the same criminals every time. Every story has a different type of criminal and a different type of crime. I would have preferred to see some supervillains, but there weren't really any supervillains for the Blue Beetle during this period. Admittedly, I could have done without the Orientals, but this was the 40s, so I can't really hold it against the comic. A lot of the pacing is rushed, but then again, all of the stories take place over the course of 2 pages each. They're quick, one-and-done stories that no one is likely to read anyway, but none of them feel particularly boring. I was engaged with them from start to finish, and I actually found myself enjoying them. Like, legitimately enjoying them as stories despite their rough nature. The descriptions are good, which is useful since unlike a comic story, we don't have artwork apart from 1 or 2 little images on the pages depicting part of a scene. I actually did feel like I could visualize these stories and see the events taking place as if I had the comic pages in front of me. They're extremely well written. Like, I could see the gas-filled room, Dan busting down the door, Dan jumping off the horse and then feeling his way around in the dark. It's pretty amazing, actually. Some of these stories are laughable, but they're not bad. They're not great, and the comic stories are superior, but the prose is decent for what was literally throwaway material that I doubt the writers put that much effort into. And I sort of wish that they were longer, because I feel like some of these stories have the potential to be full-length stories with actual dialogue and stuff. They're written sort of strangely with the Golden Age sensibilities, with all the triumphant dialogue and stuff, but if you can get past that, I highly recommend these stories. They're a fascinating bit of comics history, and part of the history of my favorite superhero. While I'd still recommend the comics if you want to get into Dan Garrett, don't just skip over these stories if you do end up reading the comics from this era. You might end up liking them as well. My one wish is that these had stuck around a little while longer, because I'd have loved to read some of these stories with Ted Kord in the role. The Blue Beetle is my favorite superhero, and despite my disagreement with canceling the current book, I can only hope that the Blue Beetle will return in some form in the future. But at least there is a veritable wealth of material that came before, and even more material that's been lost to popular consciousness, so I'll probably never read every single Blue Beetle story that exists. These stories weren't the greatest superhero stories ever written, but as early outings for the earliest iteration of the Blue Beetle, they're pretty damn good. And they gave me a crap ton of material to work with for jokes, so we will definitely be coming back to stories like these someday. Though probably with more variety than just Blue Beetle stuff. In the meantime, if you like this video, you can subscribe if you want to see other videos. If you have any comments or complaints about the video, you can leave those in the comments section below. And if you're so inclined, you can also support the show on Patreon and see videos a day early. Oh, and show this video to your friends and share it around the internet. See you next time for when I try my hand at fixing a film that mixes anime with the directors of The Matrix. And no, it's not the Animatrix. At this point, I bet you're wondering what the hell this has to do with the Blue Beetle. Well, while the pro stuff was mostly gone by the Ted time took over the mantle,